I was born in 1975. I was raised in ice-cold, frozen, anti-feminist backlash land. The idea that some CEO or COO or whatever she was going to write a book about feminism was like, well, yeah, I'll take this, in the same way that I was excited that Beyonce was on the VMAs with a big feminist sign quoting Chimamanda. I was like, yes, I will take this.
Really great to be here in this library. This is actually a library I spent a lot of time in when I was growing up, so it's actually a very meaningful thing. And it's also very meaningful to be here with Rebecca, who we've known each other mostly online for more than, I guess, almost 15 years now.
Yes.
And I want to talk a little bit by way of introducing her, just about her evolution as a writer, because I think that that's very much part of the story that's in this book. Because I first became aware of Rebecca in the sort of early part of this century in Ceylon as part of this, sort of wave of young feminist writers who were trying to recapture popular culture for feminism. And, she stood out then for her sort of, wit and incisiveness. And I think one thing that sort of interested me in the book is you mentioned you had heard from a friend, like out of the way, that somebody you knew considered your writing to be angry, and that you were taken a bit aback by that. And I was also a bit taken aback, just because I think you've always struck me as a very forceful writer, but not like, but I don't necessarily know if that's quite anger, but maybe I think the anger came later.
Absolutely.
And I think for her, as for many of us, a sort of decisive moment was the sort of 2008 election, Hillary Clinton's first run for the presidency, and the rise of Barack Obama, and all the issues of race and gender that came out of that moment, and which she turned into like a really superb book, Big Girls Don't Cry, that really captured that moment. And I think in sort of defining Rebecca, I think she's sort of a practicer of that sort of higher journalism in the sort of classic form that one associates with George Orwell or Joan Didion or Nora Ephron, sort of like, writers that are writing of the moment, but then sort of like elevate and illuminate it and really open it up. And I think that moment of 2008 really gave you your subject, and perhaps was the moment of opening up the anger, and of opening up, the feeling of hope and then hope dashed, and what that all means. And if that was true of 2008, it's all the more true of 2016, which was like where all these issues were replicated like in overdrive. It's like 2008 on cocaine, where all these issues of gender and of the sort of demonization of women and what women are permitted to say, all that came out. And that's really the subject of her latest book, which is an incredibly timely book. It's impossible to read this book without thinking about everything that's going on in the world today. And perhaps that's where I wanted to start with, because I think your book was published 5 days after the Kavanaugh hearing. And I think but everything that you write about was in the Kavanaugh hearing. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I do want to talk about the Kavanaugh hearing, but I want to go back to part of how you just introduced me, because I had never thought of it this way. So I'd never thought of it this way. I have written in the book, and I've been talking about this, that when I started to write about feminism in 2003, 2004, it was a very rudimentary approach. I had never learned a lot of women's history, a lot of feminist history. I cared very much about gender inequality, racial inequality, and economic inequality, but I had no race analysis. I had no class analysis. I had really only the most basic kinds of gender analysis. It was really feeling my way through. And obviously, angered inequality undergirded so much of what I was doing, but I took pains to cover it up. When you said the 2008 election gave me my subject, you're very right, and you said that's where the anger comes from, but fascinatingly, the thing I was most angry about in 2008, that I wouldn't have been able to put into words then, was that we were being told there was nothing to be angry about. And that in 2008, some of my feminist analysis around Hillary came from being told that there was no sexism in play. Some of what eventually became my analysis around Barack Obama was being told that we were over racism, and that racism wasn't why Michelle Obama was being vilified. That thinking about how class came into play with the way that Sarah Palin was written about, even though obviously she was somebody who ideologically was my absolute opposite, and I loathed her and wrote aggressively about her. But that I also, we were being told that these inequities there was nothing to be angry about. And that's where a lot of this book starts, because even though anger was in play in so much of my work, so much of what I was angry about was the message that the anger was invalid because these problems had been fixed and there was nothing legitimate for any of us to be angry about anymore. And I hadn't thought of it that way with 2008 as that opening, but when I go back and think of myself then as a journalist trying to cover that election, part of what I was straining against and what was pushing me to think in new ways was this, what I felt a suffocating message, that the things I was feeling were fundamentally invalid because these were problems that no longer really pertained. So I just wanted to say that your introduction made me think about my whole career in a new way. So thanks for that. So I both could believe and could not believe. While I was writing this book, and I wrote it, I knew that I was going to write it over the course of a few years. I actually imagined that I'd write it over most of the Trump administration, perhaps publishing it in 2020. And then in the middle of 2017, or toward the end, after so many women had run for office, had put their hats in the ring, the #MeToo movement, I realized I had to write it quickly. So I wound up writing it very quickly during the spring of 2018. And as I was writing it, all these things were happening, the teachers' strikes, for instance, and then the immigration protests in the summer. And everybody was saying to me, oh, if only your book was out now. Every week there seemed to be a headline that was like, if only your book were coming out now. And then I somehow hit the mother lode in the Kavanaugh hearings, and I could feel it in the weeks building up to the book's public. I was like, oh my God, putting the book aside, I was like, oh my God, is this going to happen again? This meeting of all these kinds of fury. And then what happened with those hearings is that practically every dynamic that I write about in this book got illustrated by what was happening around the appointment to the Supreme Court of a man who's going to have the power to decide voting rights and collective bargaining rights and reproductive rights for the next generation. And this was happening on screens in front of us. And so the first and most immediate thing is the fury that comes in the wake of the Trump election, that in part helps to motivate the #MeToo movement of 2017, enables there to be this conversation to begin with. I don't think that without Me Too of 2017, we probably would have gotten to perhaps Christine Blasey Ford even sending her letter, let alone there being the journalistic interest in that letter that provoked the revelation of her name and identity. Then we get to her testimony, where I sat there. I was 5 days away from publishing this book about the power of women's anger, and you can bet that I sat on that couch being like, don't raise your voice. Don't raise your voice. And that's just true, because I knew, in part because of writing this book, the kind of punishment and censure and the fact that an expression of anger can redound, and usually does redound negatively to the women who are expressing it. And I watched and understood exactly why she was expressing herself within this very, very narrow range. Solicitous, she kept saying, I just want to be collegial, everything the opposite of anger, even though she had so much to be angry about. And then that afternoon, I watched Brett Kavanaugh go in. And as a powerful white man, really, lots of people have said, well, what if Christine Blasey Ford had been angry? Can you imagine? Can anybody imagine a scenario in which she went in there and even raised her voice saying, I've been, the trauma of this has been intense, or he held me down, or anything with volume and assertion, let alone the kind of challenge to the questioners that Kavanaugh was able to do later that day?
Yeah.
I like beer. Right?
Yeah.
She would have been arrested. She would have been taken away for being unstable and hysterical. But he was able to wield it. It wasn't just that she couldn't use it and he could. It was that he could use it to his benefit. he could use it as a weapon. And that comes from the fact that as a powerful white man, he's presumed to be rational in his speech. And therefore, the expression of emotion only underlines how extra rational and extra righteous he is, right? Even if he's babbling it with gibberish. But then the next day, the two women in the elevator, Ana Maria Archila and Maria Gallagher, who were not trying to convince a Senate Judiciary Committee, though they were speaking to a senator, but what their willingness to raise their shaking voices and point a finger and say, look me in the eye and listen and hear and acknowledge me as human, was so powerful to the masses. That was anger as a communicative tool. And I think for millions of women, a relief and a channeling of the kind of rage that they felt unable to express, let alone to a senator in an elevator. So all of these forms of rage were on display.
And but not just Kavanaugh. I mean, like the Republicans that supported him, like Lindsey Graham.
Well, that was his audition for Trump. The idea that for a powerful white man to be considered extra strong by an extra strong white patriarch, you have to have a fit of rage. I mean, he sounded. There was one other complication, which is that I thought for 48 hours, my God, maybe we are hearing anger differently, because there was that period where lots of people, including Saturday Night Live, were acknowledging that Brett Kavanaugh had sounded like an ass. That he had sounded in all kinds of, in fact, the very ways that women's anger is so often written off, as a hysteric, infantile, a baby throwing a temper tantrum. And Lindsey Graham had sounded the same way. And there was a moment where there was a little piece of me that was like, oh my God, are we actually hearing this anger differently enough that it's not going to work to his benefit? But no, we were not. But
well, no, but I think there was an audience that Graham was definitely speaking to, and there was an audience that Trump speaks to when he rants and raves. There are people for whom I think the phrase you use in your book, which is a lovely phrase, is performative dickishness. But there's there are people for whom performative dickishness is a mark of authenticity and a power.
I think I used that phrase about Mitch McConnell.
That's what you did. That's right.
He has earned that phrase. But it's a lot of them, really. And the other thing about the Kavanaugh hearings, even predating Christine Blasey Ford's accusations being made public, even before that, the protesters who'd been there in the chamber, holding signs, getting up and yelling about abortion, about Roe v. Wade, about the way that they had been treated by those sitting senators, long before anybody knew Christine Blasey Ford's name. Orrin Hatch, who had been there long enough that he'd also been on Anita Hill's committee in 1991. True, he and Chuck Grassley. And I think one of the Democrats, but I can't remember which one. Was it Leahy? I don't remember. Orrin Hatch said about a woman who literally had gotten up on the first day of the hearings and yelled, a protester yelling, "If you repeal Obamacare, I will die." Orrin Hatch said, "Get this loudmouth out of here. We shouldn't have to deal with this." And that same day, Senator Ben Sasse got up and described the protesters who were yelling about reproductive autonomy as a matter of life and death. Oh, we've been hearing this for decades. It's a form of hysteria.
Yeah.
Good times.
So good times. But it does seem like in two of your books, at least now, the sort of tragic heroine is Hillary Clinton, who is the sort of figure who's kind of caught in this trap because she's aware of that these problems exist, but there are all these cultural forms that prevent her from being able to articulate it, or that make her articulate it in ways that have her misheard. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Somebody once described to me, a friend of mine once compared, this is one of the saddest comparisons, once compared Hillary Clinton to me to an octopus, saying that octopi are so smart that they know that they're in the trap, but they can't get out. And that they're aware the whole time that they're being trapped and fished, but that they can't, because of the nature of the traps, find the way out of them. And I was like, yeah, that's Hillary Clinton. It's interesting, I rarely attach the word heroine to her because she is such a fraught figure, and I've written about her for years. She means an enormous amount to me. She's such a powerful figure in part because she has lived through so much changed history and has been at the same time a beneficiary of so much progress as a wealthy white woman who has, of a population that has benefited the most from all kinds of the mid-century's social and political movements. Also is still fundamentally, she's actually an example of one of the great lessons of what happens when you find the way to work within a system that fundamentally makes no room for you, and you find your way to get to the top of it and discover that even when you've navigated it like she won white patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
That you're still fundamentally oppressed within that system. And that is, that's also, interestingly, this is something I've spoken about with Brittany Cooper, who's this brilliant writer who wrote also a book about women's anger. She writes about black feminist rage. It's called Eloquent Rage. And she and I have spoken about this at length, that there are these series of these figures, and Hillary Clinton is one of them, along with some of the very privileged white women, very wealthy white actresses who told their stories of being raped by Harvey Weinstein. And Christine Blasey Ford, herself a married middle-class white woman. These are all examples over the past couple of years of women who have actually, within a white patriarchal social and political system, benefited and figured out how to navigate it, and yet come to the end of their navigation and discover that there are limits to their power. Clinton in particular, it's interesting, I write about her here briefly with regard to anger, because one of the things about the 2016 election is that she was running against two competitors on the left and on the right who used anger so powerfully and were credited, I think, correctly, for as politicians for being able to channel the fury of their supporters in ways that were communicatively effective. So you had Bernie Sanders, whose rage about economic inequality was, he was gruff, he chided, he shook his fingers and and it was inspiring to a lot of people because his message was fundamentally one of rage at economic inequality. It was a correct message. And Donald Trump channeled the punitive, revanchist rage of white America, white patriarchal America. Obviously, he screamed and threatened violence and gave voice to direct racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. And Hillary Clinton was, I think, also correctly criticized for not being a natural orator, not a terrific communicator, in part because she didn't come across as authentic. She couldn't really speak to the anger in America, in the United States. But at the very same time, if she talked too closely into a microphone, somebody would get on television and say, she's yelling, I hate her voice. And these weren't marginal figures. These were the news anchors. These were the people who were telling our political stories, were genuinely calling her shrill. I just hate, Bob Woodward was saying the problem with Hillary is she sounds angry. At the very same time that people were saying the problem with Hillary is I don't believe she's angry on behalf of anybody. And how do you, and again, she bears the burden of being the first and only, and that happened in 2008 and it happened in 2016. If I could have had one wish, and I wrote this actually, Jeet and I worked together at the New Republic for several years, and I wrote a story about this saying, please, other women run in 2016, challenge Hillary Clinton, don't let this, in part because it is bad, it's bad that we have these singular people who bear the weight of representation for historically underrepresented populations. And they also bear the brunt of every bias and double standard. And if we could adjust our eyes and ears to enact, it's one of the things that's so revolutionary and remarkable about the electoral results this week. If we actually diversify our politics, that's one of the ways that we alter a system so that not every figure has to be in this jammed little tight corner.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And that is one of the great achievements of coming out of the last election, although it's almost a paradoxical achievement, and it is, one of these one step forward, two steps back, because just as the Democrats are becoming a much more diverse party, and it's something like only 40% of Democrats in Congress are white men, which is pretty close to the population level, which is like 35, 36.
Is it 40%?
Yeah, only 40% are white men. But 90% of Republicans in Congress are white men, and that's actually an increase. The Republicans in the last election have become more white and more male.
Right.
Because the only Mia Love, I think, is going to lose in Utah.
Right.
And
that was it.
And there's a bunch of sort of moderate Republicans in Congress that lost, women that lost. So you're actually getting this weird gender division between the two parties, where like the Republicans are the party of white men, but that maybe gets us like, how can they? This is something you really discuss in the book. Like, how can they, if they're representing this minority, this 36% of the population, how do they win?
Well, this is how, the United States, its government, its economy, its courts was built around white patriarchy. In ways that were encoded in its founding documents and remain true for lots of ways. The unenfranchisement of the majority, the barring of the majority from legal protections, even acknowledgement of full humanity in the case of enslaved African Americans at the founding. And it has, of course, been a multi-century project to chip away at those kinds of inequality and push toward something like greater inclusion, but we're still at, I think that 40% number is about the incoming class.
Yeah, the incoming class.
Right.
Actually, I'd have to check, but yeah.
I think it's the incoming class.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
But how does a minority power in a purported representative democracy maintain its incredible grip on all of these systems and institutions? Well, in part, it's about dividing a majority against itself, because in theory, a united majority in a democracy, especially one where after centuries there have been wins for enfranchisement and participation, theoretically could rise up and defeat the minority. And that's always been the risk that's on the table. That's why, in fact, everybody was unenfranchised from the start. But what you do is you extend certain kind of benefits. And so white patriarchy extends the benefit of patriarchy to men across races. And it extends the benefits of white supremacy to white women who are, thanks to their proximate relation to white men, enjoy proximal power in a white patriarchy. And so you have a majority of white women who historically, since we've been keeping track, which is in 1952, vote on behalf of conservative politics and parties that represent white patriarchal interests. And it goes beyond 1952. One of the arguments for the enfranchisement of women after the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which enfranchised black men post-emancipation, was that if white women could vote, they would cancel out the votes of black men. So the idea that white women would operate as foot soldiers of a white patriarchy has always been in play in the United States, and it has historically held. And that's part of how the minority power keeps its power. It's also true that they still have this control, for example, on the judiciary. This is why they pushed through Brett Kavanaugh. So this past week, we saw an example of how mass anger can affect change, right? It actually affected representational change, so that there were more than 110 women, and they're still counting ballots, and so it's probably maybe going to be closer to 120 women, are elected to the House of Representatives and as governors last week, and many of them are women of color. This is a systemic change. You also saw votes for the re-enfranchisement of convicted felons in Florida, which will re-enfranchise 1.6 million Floridians and theoretically could turn that state reliably blue in the future. You saw other states passing on the ballot laws that challenge the redistricting that have left so many states gerrymandered. So there is mass power to alter the systems through dissent, through anger, through organizing, protest, and electoral participation. But at the very same time, this is why they forced through Brett Kavanaugh, because you have a body that has the power to control the mechanisms that can suppress that dissent. So it's the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 that paved the way for some of the disenfranchisement that has left. For example, Stacey Abrams, who clearly had more support in Georgia and would have been the first black woman elected governor in the country's history, it leaves her probably never going to be governor. I mean, she's still pushing for a recount, but because of voter suppression tactics that were no longer illegal because the Supreme Court had gutted the Voting Rights Act. That's the ability that they have. If they can gut collective bargaining, if they can gut voting rights, if they can gut affirmative action, and of course they've already all taken steps on all of this. I don't want to pretend that all these things are in great shape as it stands. So if they can do further damage to reproductive rights, then those top mechanisms that have so much power, actually what they're aiming to do is undo the progress of these centuries that have gotten us to affirmative action, full enfranchisement, reproductive rights, the things that have permitted more inclusion and participation in the democracy and in the systems, in the economy, in the courts, and so that's the battle. It's between the masses' ability to resist and the power structure's ability to clamp down on the masses' power to resist.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I think...
I'm sorry.
No. There's a whole bunch of things you said, which I wanted to kind of go back to. I'm trying to think of the best line forward. I think that, so there's that sort of division, but there's also, I guess, this sort of question which you raised before about, if you are the sort of tragic figure. I said heroine in a sort of literary way rather than...
No, and you're right. I think of her as a literary heroine too. That is true.
Yeah, but because I wanted to bring in that conversation we were having before this about Sandberg and about this sort of whole issue of, the path forward that you're suggesting is sort of mass organization, is the path through Congress and mass mobilization. And then, but there's always also leaders. And there's a kind of, I think, an interesting divide in feminism over the last decade between the sort of Sheryl Sandberg model of, becoming a leader, leaning in.
Right.
And then the path of sort of democratic mobilization.
Right.
So, and I think Sandberg is actually particularly interesting today just because the New York Times did a big expose of Facebook. So do you want to talk about some of the sort of arguments of, these are sort of arguments we have within ourselves.
Yeah, I touch on this very briefly in this book, but there was a huge conflagration. If feminism in the media sort of came back to life in a mainstream media, and I don't mean to, there were feminists operating at the margins throughout the 1980s and the 1990s in really crucial ways, but the backlash that happened in the Reagan era and persisted through a Clinton era, I think, was really chilling to a mainstream feminist conversation. But it sort of came back in the media and in pop culture in those early years of the new millennium. And one of the biggest fights, as somebody who was participating in that pop mainstream conversation, was over the publication of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. Now, how many people here remember that book or read it? Anybody? Okay. Did anybody here, and this is not, I'm going to tell you both sides of this, so don't, who here liked that book? Be honest. I'll be honest, because I did. I'm going to be honest. Okay. All right. So, and the rest of you hated it from the start. Who, you hated it from the start? Okay. Oh, then that doesn't count. Okay, so I was a feminist journalist. I was asked to review Lean In. I read it. I thought it was fine. I liked it. In fact, and there was a way in which, and it may be the era in which, I was born in 1975. I was raised in ice-cold, frozen, anti-feminist backlash land. The idea that some CEO or COO or whatever she was going to write a book about feminism was like, well, yeah, I'll take this, in the same way that I was excited that Beyonce was on the VMAs with a big feminist sign quoting Chimamanda. I was like, yes, I will take this re-injection of feminism into a popular conversation because, my God, I have been raised in a world in which if you said it, people came at you and said, you're a feminazi with hairy armpits and you hate sex. I mean, that was where I was raised. And by the way, there is nothing wrong with not shaving your armpits. So I came at it as I thought it was like Feminism 101. It was pretty basic, but I thought it was an acknowledgement of a lot of the roadblocks that are in front of women in workplaces. Now, there was a massive, furious pushback against it at the time of its publication. And I resisted some of that pushback, in part because I thought it was saying something that the criticism was saying that she was saying, oh, you just have to work in order to win at feminism. I hadn't read the book that way, actually. I had read it as an examination of actually a lot of sort of systemic biases, drawing on good, solid feminist research. I just thought it was more nuanced than its critics said it was. But there was also a fundamental question that I agreed with, but I just didn't, which was, feminism is supposed to upend capitalism. It is not supposed to participate in capitalism. At the time, my reaction, I had conversations about this, I was like, sure, of course, except if we have to ask everybody who wants to be an acknowledged feminist to destroy a system that so far no one else has managed to effectively and successfully destroy before we take them seriously as a feminist, then we're like setting the bar really high for any feminist conversation. In retrospect, I see those challenges to Sandberg, to my sort of general like A-OK appreciation for that book. I see the challenges to that as really crucial and informative to what the next project that we're now in the midst of going through is. And I think that's great. And it's not quite that I'm saying like all the critics were right and I was wrong. This is not like self-flagellation. Like I understand why I felt that way at the time, but I think that was one of the first signs that there was a generation of people who were not raised like I was in the Reagan and Bush administrations with extremely low expectations for what feminism could ask of a public. People who were raised and came to adulthood perhaps in an Obama administration with Black Lives Matter and slut walks, which I know started here, and Occupy Wall Street, who said, wait a minute, no, we got this guy who everybody tells us is a great president, but we know we can do better and we can alter the systems and we're gonna ask for more. And that was part of what they were pushing to, and I think that's part of what we're in the midst of now, post-2016. I think some people saw the Bernie campaign as a symptom of that. I didn't, in part because I was worried about, I agree with Bernie's politics terrifically. I was very worried about the possibilities of one guy at the top of an intransigent and fundamentally centrist party being able to enact the kinds of change he was talking about. But what we're doing now in the wake of the Bernie campaign, in part because of the Bernie campaign, is changing the party on the grassroots, building an infrastructure outside the party, these new organizations that have risen up that try to change how fundraising works, how participation works, trying to undo the damage of voter suppression and gerrymandering. That kind of stuff is crucial to remaking an American left and remaking the systems and pushing for economic policy that does fundamentally challenge capitalism and the capitalist shape of a Democratic Party in a way that I think is profoundly crucial and exciting and thrilling. And I think that was at the root of that Sheryl Sandberg conversation where I was on the wrong side, but I think that what was there was where we could see a preview of where we are, I hope now, and where I hope we go next.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like I think a lot. I mean, I've also had that same sort of rethinking of the Sandberg book. But I think that there's another side to this, which is that even though I think that shift to the left on economics has been revolutionary, crucially important. It's the way forward. But there is ways in which, and this might go to some of your Bernie skepticism, there are parts of the left that are very gender blind. And are very,
yes.
And I don't think we shouldn't just stop and say, those terrible Republicans, Kavanaugh, Trump. There's that sort of, the whole sort of dirtbag left and the sort of, that was also a big source of misogyny.
Right. Well, that's the history also. And that's true. I think that it is widely acknowledged, for example, that the women's movement in all its iterations has had a racism problem, right? We also have to acknowledge that the left in all its iterations has had race and gender problems. And that's the internal inequities, even within progressive coalitions, are something that it's not fun to look at, because theoretically we're all on the side of progress, but within these coalitions that we form and that we need to form, and that I believe in making fundamentally unwieldy, alliances with people in order to achieve the kind of progress that we want to. But it's very difficult to look within those coalitions and say, you know what, there is tremendous bias and inequity repeated here. And the American left, historically, and in fact, the left around the world, has had terrible gender problems, in addition to terrible race problems, which is also not unrelated to some of the stuff around Bernie's campaign.
Yes.
So and that's just part of the process, just as it's part of the process to look hard at a women's movement in every form it's ever taken and say, you know what? There's racism that's defined whose perspectives are heard, whose leadership is acknowledged, what kind of appropriation has taken place. We also have to do the same thing on the left and say, you know, we need to acknowledge the gender problems on the left.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's and I think in some ways there's a kind of left perspective that's also a denial of anger that doesn't want to see women as having specific problems and grievances and issues like that.
Well, it's not so distant sometimes from that thing I talked about earlier, which is that I was referring to a kind of pop culture messaging saying there's nothing really to be angry about anymore. What do you want? We elected a black president. The next president is definitely going to be Hillary Clinton. Inevitable, twice inevitable. Weird. And so, you know, come on, she's the establishment. Obama, the black man, is the establishment. This is not, you're borrowing your anger from other eras, was basically, and there are actually a whole bunch of black journalists have recently been writing about recalling how their writing about Trump's candidacy as openly racist was called hysterical at the time. The similar language used. So this message that there's nothing really to be angry about, I think that is often echoed on the left. Like, come on, you're all Sheryl Sandbergs, basically. If you want to talk about sexism, you're all bourgeois, neoliberal corporate feminists to want to talk about to want to talk about sexism on the left, and I don't agree.
Yeah. Okay, good.